The internet never forgets, but sometimes it takes exactly one moment to remember who you really are. The lunch crowd at Harbor and Vine moved with the polished rhythm of a place where expensive watches caught the afternoon sunlight, and every table carried conversations about mergers, investments, and vacation homes. Crystal glasses chimed softly beneath warm pendant lights. Servers crossed the polished oak floor with practiced grace, and the scent of grilled salmon, rosemary, and fresh sourdough drifted through the room. Naomi Brooks balanced a silver tray against one hand as she navigated between crowded tables, her black apron neatly pressed, her name stitched in white thread above the pocket. She had worked the lunch shift 6 days a week for nearly 3 years, memorizing regular customers, calming impatient guests with quiet smiles, and treating every person the same regardless of the number printed on their credit card. Few people noticed her beyond the moment their coffee cup needed refilling, and she had learned long ago that invisibility often came with the job. At precisely 12:17 p.m., the front doors swung open, and the entire atmosphere shifted without anyone announcing why. Richard Caldwell entered surrounded by executives wearing tailored navy suits, assistants carrying leather portfolios, and a public relations team already discussing camera angles for an interview scheduled later that afternoon. Richard walked as though every square foot of the restaurant belonged to him. At 54, he had become one of the most recognizable CEOs in America, celebrated on magazine covers for building a billion-dollar technology empire while speaking endlessly about leadership, discipline, and respect. Employees rushed to prepare the private dining section. The manager adjusted his tie twice before greeting the distinguished guests, and whispers spread across nearby tables as diners recognized the famous businessman. Naomi simply picked up another water pitcher and continued working. To her, every guest deserved the same courtesy. When Richard's party settled into their reserved table, she approached with a calm expression and welcomed them exactly as she welcomed everyone else. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naomi. I'll be taking care of you today." Before she could finish placing the first glass of water, one of the assistants abruptly pushed a chair backward, causing a splash of iced tea to streak across the polished floor near Richard's Italian leather shoe. The spill barely touched the edge of the sole, but Richard looked down as if something priceless had been ruined. He slowly lifted his gaze toward Naomi, his expression cold enough to silence the conversations around him. "Well," he said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear, "aren't you going to get down there and clean my shoe?" The words floated through the dining room like a sudden winter wind. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Nearby conversations stopped mid-sentence. Naomi glanced at the small splash on the floor, then back at Richard. Her heartbeat quickened, but her posture never changed. She reached into the pocket of her apron, removed a clean white linen cloth, folded it carefully once, and placed it gently on the edge of the table within his reach. Her voice remained steady, respectful, and unmistakably firm. "Sir," she said, meeting his eyes without raising her own voice, "I'm happy to clean the floor, but I won't kneel so another person can feel taller." Silence settled over the restaurant so completely that even the faint hum of the espresso machine seemed distant. Several diners exchanged stunned looks. A young woman seated near the windows instinctively raised her phone, intending at first to text someone, but instead her thumb tapped the camera icon. Across the room, another guest quietly started recording as well. Richard stared at Naomi for a long second before a faint, dismissive smile appeared on his face, the kind worn by someone convinced that power alone could rewrite the meaning of dignity. No one moved for several long seconds. The white linen cloth rested untouched beside Richard Caldwell's plate, while the quiet tension spread across the restaurant like ripples across still water. Naomi Brooks simply lowered her eyes, not in surrender, but in discipline. She picked up the small towel reserved for spills, knelt, only long enough to wipe the iced tea from the hardwood floor itself, then stood again with the same calm professionalism she had carried since the beginning of her shift. She did not look at the guests who had begun whispering. She did not notice the tiny red recording light glowing from more than one smartphone across the dining room. She only asked in the same steady voice, "Would anyone care for sparkling water while you review the menu?" The question sounded almost unbelievable after what had just happened, yet it revealed more about her character than any speech ever could. Naomi had learned years earlier that dignity was not something another person could hand to you, and it was certainly not something they could take away with a cruel sentence. Every morning before sunrise, she left the small brick duplex she shared with her mother on the west side of Baltimore. The drive to Harbor and Vine took nearly 40 minutes through traffic, but she never complained. By 6:30 each morning, she had already helped her mother organize medications, prepared breakfast, and packed tomorrow's insurance paperwork before heading to work with coffee in a reusable cup that had long since lost its original color. Few people inside the restaurant knew that every dollar of her paycheck mattered. Her mother, Gloria Brooks, had spent nearly 30 years as an elementary school librarian before chronic kidney disease forced an early retirement. Medical bills had quietly replaced family vacations. Prescription costs had replaced birthday celebrations. Naomi never spoke about those sacrifices because she believed hardship was something to carry with grace rather than display for sympathy. Years earlier, she had been studying journalism at the University of Maryland. Her professors often praised her ability to notice details other people ignored, telling stories with honesty instead of noise. She dreamed of becoming an investigative reporter who exposed corruption and defended ordinary people whose voices were rarely heard. Then her mother's diagnosis changed everything. Without hesitation, Naomi withdrew before her senior year began. Friends promised she would return the following semester. The following semester became the following year, and eventually those promises faded into quiet memories. She accepted double shifts at Harbor and Vine because the health insurance helped cover treatments that otherwise would have been impossible to afford. Even after exhausting 10-hour shifts, she still spent evenings reading books borrowed from the public library, studying journalism ethics, constitutional law, and media history as though classes had never truly ended. Her coworkers often joked that Naomi probably knew more than half the customers discussing politics over expensive lunches, but she always smiled and changed the subject. She never wanted knowledge to become another reason for pride. What mattered to her was simple. Every guest deserved kindness until they proved they wanted something else. Every difficult day eventually ended. Every person carried burdens invisible to strangers. Those beliefs had become part of her long before she tied on the black apron each morning. Back inside the dining room, the manager finally approached Richard Caldwell's table with an anxious smile stretched across his face. Around them, conversations slowly resumed, although many eyes continued drifting toward Naomi as she quietly refilled coffee cups at nearby tables. Hidden inside jacket pockets and resting beside folded napkins, several phones continued recording. None of the people holding them realized they were preserving far more than an uncomfortable exchange inside an elegant restaurant. They were capturing two completely different definitions of power, and before the day was over, millions of people would be asked which one they believed deserved their respect. Richard Caldwell had built an empire by convincing the world that excellence demanded impossible standards, and for more than 2 decades people had applauded him for it. Financial magazines called him visionary. Business schools studied his leadership strategies. Morning television hosts praised his discipline, while podcasts introduced him as the executive who transformed a struggling software startup into one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. His face appeared regularly beside headlines celebrating innovation, resilience, and corporate success. Investors admired him because quarterly earnings rarely disappointed. Employees respected him because promotions often followed hard work. At least that was the image carefully presented to the public. Behind polished interviews and perfectly rehearsed speeches lived a man who quietly measured human value by status, income, and influence. Richard believed respect flowed downward from power instead of upward from character. To him, executives earned attention. Servers delivered meals. Custodians cleaned floors. Assistants carried schedules. Everyone occupied a place in an invisible ladder that should never be questioned. It was a philosophy he had never spoken aloud during shareholder meetings, yet it shaped nearly every interaction he had with people outside his professional circle. Even his closest advisors understood the unspoken rule. Do not challenge him in public. Do not interrupt him. Do not allow anyone to damage the carefully cultivated image of absolute control. Around the table that afternoon, several executives exchanged uneasy glances without daring to speak. They had seen Richard embarrass employees before. They had watched meetings end with careers quietly disappearing after someone disagreed with him. Most had learned that silence was the safest form of loyalty. His communications director, Emily Parker, noticed the growing number of phones pointed toward the table and leaned closer. "Richard," she whispered carefully, "perhaps we should move forward with lunch." He barely acknowledged her. His attention remained fixed on Naomi Brooks, who stood only a few feet away waiting patiently, her hands folded lightly in front of her apron. She showed no anger, no fear, no desire to argue. Somehow that calm unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. He expected apologies. He expected nervous explanations. Instead, she offered neither. The quiet confidence in her posture felt almost like a challenge, although she had not raised her voice once. Richard leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "Interesting," he said with a thin smile. "Confidence is admirable when it is supported by accomplishment." Several people around the table forced polite laughter, uncertain whether they were expected to join him. Naomi simply nodded once. "Everyone deserves respect, sir," she answered softly. "Accomplishment does not change that." The sentence lasted only a few seconds, yet it settled over the dining room with surprising weight. An older couple near the windows stopped eating altogether. A father seated with his teenage daughter quietly lowered his fork. The daughter looked from Naomi to Richard, then back again, watching two entirely different ideas of leadership unfold without either person raising their voice. Emily Parker noticed another phone lifting into view across the restaurant. Then another. She felt an uncomfortable knot tighten in her stomach. Public relations campaigns could repair disappointing earnings. They could explain delayed product launches. They could even soften executive scandals with carefully crafted statements. But authentic moments had a dangerous habit of escaping every strategy. Once ordinary people decided a story belonged to them, no communications team could control where it traveled next. Richard remained unaware of the invisible current beginning to move through the room. He believed the moment had already ended because, in his experience, powerful people always decided when conversations were over. What he could not see was that dozens of quiet observers had already reached a very different conclusion, and somewhere beyond the restaurant walls, the first video had just begun its silent journey across the internet. The manager finally stepped between them with the careful smile of someone trying to keep expensive glass from breaking. Daniel Mercer had spent 15 years working in fine dining, and he understood that reputation could disappear faster than a dropped wine bottle. He looked first at Richard Caldwell, then at Naomi Brooks, silently hoping one of them would choose to end the moment. Neither did. Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket as though the conversation had already been decided. "Daniel," he said without taking his eyes off Naomi, "your employee seems confused about what customer service means." Daniel forced a polite nod. "I am sure this is just a misunderstanding, sir." Naomi remained perfectly still. Her breathing was slow. Her expression was calm. She had spent too many years helping frightened hospital patients navigate paperwork with her mother to let another person's anger dictate her own actions. Richard reached for the folded linen cloth resting beside his plate and held it between two fingers. "This," he said, lifting it slightly, "is all she had to do." The room seemed smaller than it had only minutes earlier. Even the soft jazz playing through the ceiling speakers felt strangely distant. Daniel turned toward Naomi, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Naomi, maybe we can resolve this privately." She understood what he was asking. One small apology, even for something she had not done wrong, would likely end the confrontation. She could finish her shift, collect her paycheck, and drive home before sunset. It would be the practical choice. It would also stay with her every time she looked into a mirror. Naomi slowly met Daniel's worried eyes before looking back toward Richard. "I sincerely apologize that your lunch was interrupted," she said with complete professionalism. "I will gladly replace your beverage, clean the floor, and make certain your meal is perfect. But I cannot apologize for treating myself with the same dignity I offer every guest." No one laughed. No one whispered. The sentence settled across the dining room with quiet certainty. Richard's smile disappeared. He leaned slightly forward, resting both hands on the white tablecloth. "Do you know who you are speaking to?" he asked. Naomi answered almost immediately. "Yes, sir. I know exactly who I am speaking to." Richard waited for the rest of the sentence, expecting recognition of his achievements or his position. Instead, she continued softly, "And I also know who I am." For the first time since entering the restaurant, Richard found himself without an immediate response. His executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emily Parker noticed another notification flashing across a nearby customer's phone screen. A teenager at the next table quietly replayed the recording he had just captured before sending it to someone else. The manager felt the atmosphere slipping beyond anyone's control. Richard finally broke the silence with a short, dismissive laugh. "If that is your attitude," he said, "perhaps this establishment needs employees who understand hospitality." Daniel closed his eyes for the briefest moment before speaking the words he wished he did not have to say. "Naomi, I need you to step away from the dining room for now." She nodded once. There was no argument, no visible frustration. She removed the order pad from her apron pocket, placed it gently on the service station beside the coffee machine, and untied the black apron with slow, steady hands. Around the restaurant, guests watched in complete silence as though witnessing something far larger than a disagreement between a customer and a waitress. Naomi folded the apron neatly into a perfect square before placing it beside the register. "Thank you for the opportunity to serve here," she said quietly to Daniel. "I truly hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon." Without another word, she turned toward the employee hallway leading to the back entrance. Behind her, several phones remained raised. Ahead of her, sunlight poured through the narrow glass door at the end of the corridor, while somewhere beyond those walls, the first uploaded video had already begun gathering more attention than anyone inside Harbor and Vine could possibly imagine. Naomi pushed open the heavy steel door leading to the employee exit, and the noise of the dining room disappeared behind her, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the gentle rustle of maple leaves moving in the warm afternoon breeze. Sunlight reflected across the narrow service alley, turning the brick walls a soft golden color. She stood still for a moment, taking one slow breath before carefully folding her apron one final time and placing it inside the canvas tote she carried every day. Her phone vibrated once, then again, then several more times in rapid succession. She assumed her co-workers were checking on her, but she could not bring herself to look. There would be time for messages later. Right now, she needed to think about how she was going to explain another unexpected setback to her mother without adding more worry to an already difficult week. Inside the restaurant, lunch service continued, although almost no one seemed interested in the food anymore. Richard Caldwell resumed discussing acquisition numbers with his executives, convinced the interruption had ended exactly as it should have. He believed authority had once again restored order. Emily Parker quietly glanced beneath the table at her phone and noticed something unusual. A notification from a social media monitoring application appeared with a sharp chime. One short video mentioning Richard's name had already gathered several thousand views in less than 20 minutes. She frowned and refreshed the screen. The number climbed again before her eyes. Another post appeared from a different account. Then another. Different camera angles. Different captions. The same unforgettable exchange. She looked toward Richard, considering whether to interrupt the meeting, but decided against it. It was probably temporary. Viral moments came and went every day. Outside, Naomi walked toward the employee parking lot, passing rows of delivery trucks and stacks of wooden produce crates waiting for the evening shipment. As she reached her aging silver sedan, she noticed someone calling her name. Daniel Mercer hurried through the back door, slightly out of breath. He carried a plain white envelope in one hand. "Naomi," he said quietly, "I am truly sorry." She accepted the envelope without opening it. Daniel looked exhausted. "You handled yourself with more grace than anyone inside that building today." Naomi offered him a gentle smile. "I know you had a difficult decision." Daniel lowered his eyes. "That does not make it feel right." Before either of them could say more, another employee rushed outside holding a phone. "Daniel," she called, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. "You need to look at this." Daniel accepted the phone. Across the screen played the now familiar scene from the dining room. Only this version already displayed hundreds of thousands of views. Comments poured in faster than they could be read. New shares appeared every second. People from across the country were reacting to Naomi's calm response, praising her composure while criticizing the behavior they had witnessed. A well-known food blogger had reposted the clip. Moments later, A national news reporter shared it again. The numbers accelerated almost faster than the application could update. Daniel slowly raised his eyes toward Naomi. She looked genuinely confused. "What is happening?" she asked softly. He turned the phone toward her. She watched only a few seconds before quietly looking away. "I never wanted anyone to be embarrassed," she said. "I only wanted to do my job with respect." At that exact moment, back inside the private dining room, Emily Parker's phone rang. The caller identification displayed the chairman of the board. She felt her heartbeat quicken as she answered. Her expression changed almost immediately. She looked across the table at Richard Caldwell, who was still speaking confidently about leadership, completely unaware that the world outside Harbor and Vine had already begun reaching a very different conclusion about the kind of leader he truly was. Naomi sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. The late afternoon sun stretched across the windshield, painting long ribbons of amber light over the worn fabric seats. Outside, traffic drifted steadily along the boulevard, ordinary people heading home without knowing that a quiet moment inside an elegant restaurant had already become part of a national conversation. She rested both hands on the folded apron lying in her lap and closed her eyes for a moment. Losing a job hurt, not because of pride, but because responsibilities did not pause for disappointment. Her mother's next medical appointment was only 4 days away. The rent would be due the following week. There were groceries to buy, prescriptions to refill, and another stack of utility bills waiting on the kitchen counter. Yet beneath all those worries, one thought remained surprisingly peaceful. She had not betrayed herself. That realization settled over her like a warm blanket on a cold evening. She reached for her phone at last. The screen illuminated with hundreds of missed notifications. Friends from college had written messages of encouragement. Former co-workers she had not spoken to in years asked whether she was all right. Neighbors, cousins, and complete strangers had somehow found her account, leaving words of support that felt almost impossible to believe. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she quietly placed the phone face down beside her purse and looked through the windshield toward the fading sunlight. Kindness had never been something she practiced because people were watching. It was simply the person she had decided to become. Across the city, inside a sleek corner office overlooking Baltimore Harbor, the atmosphere inside Caldwell Technologies looked very different from the confidence that had filled the restaurant only hours earlier. Emily Parker stood beside a large conference table while multiple television screens displayed identical headlines. News anchors replayed the restaurant footage from different angles. Business commentators questioned whether the behavior reflected the values promoted by the company. Financial analysts discussed reputational risk before the stock market even opened the next morning. The communications team refreshed social media dashboards every few seconds as view counts climbed into the millions. What had begun as a handful of phone recordings was now spreading across every major platform. Richard Caldwell entered the room expecting a routine strategy meeting. Instead, he found complete silence. No one reached for coffee. No one opened a presentation. Emily handed him a tablet without speaking. He watched the short video once. Then again. This time he noticed details he had ignored inside the restaurant. Naomi had never raised her voice. She had never insulted him. She had never reacted with anger. The contrast between her calm expression and his own visible frustration felt uncomfortable in a way quarterly losses never had. He looked around the room searching for reassurance, but every face reflected the same concern. Outside the office windows, the harbor shimmered beneath the evening light while the city carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet inside that conference room, certainty had begun to crack. Back in her car, Naomi finally started the engine. Soft, instrumental music filled the cabin as she pulled slowly onto the road. She did not know where tomorrow's paycheck would come from. She did not know whether another restaurant would hire someone whose face had suddenly become recognizable across the country. But she knew something that could not be measured by headlines, promotions, or public opinion. Respect that depends on power disappears the moment power changes hands. Respect built on character quietly remains, even when everything else seems uncertain. As the sun slipped below the skyline, golden light reflected across her windshield, and somewhere far behind her, millions of strangers continued watching the same 60 seconds that she was already trying to leave behind. By the following morning, The story had traveled farther than anyone inside Harbor and Vine could have imagined. Television programs replayed the footage beside discussions about leadership and respect in the workplace. Radio hosts debated whether success meant anything if it came without humility. Newspapers that usually filled their business sections with market reports instead published still images of a quiet waitress standing with calm dignity before one of the country's most recognizable executives. Yet something even more unexpected began to happen. The conversation slowly shifted away from the confrontation itself and toward the woman at the center of it. Former customers started posting their own memories of Naomi Brooks. One elderly veteran shared that she had quietly paid for his lunch after noticing he was counting loose change at the register. A single mother wrote that Naomi had entertained her restless 5-year-old with crayons and paper for nearly an hour without expecting anything in return. Another guest remembered leaving an expensive watch behind after a business dinner and discovering that Naomi had personally secured it until he returned the next morning. None of those stories had ever reached the internet before because Naomi had never spoken about them. She believed kindness was something to practice, not advertise. As the hours passed, dozens became hundreds, and hundreds became thousands. Teachers, nurses, delivery drivers, firefighters, students, and restaurant workers from across the country added their voices. They were not defending someone because she had become famous. They were recognizing the kind of character that usually went unnoticed until the world finally stopped to look. Inside Caldwell Technologies, the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing hour. Several major investors requested emergency meetings. 2 nonprofit organizations quietly announced they were postponing planned partnerships with the company. Recruitment specialists reported candidates withdrawing applications. Employees who had admired Richard Caldwell for years found themselves asking difficult questions they had never considered before. During an executive meeting, the chairman of the board folded his hands across the polished conference table and looked directly at Richard. "The financial impact can be repaired," he said evenly. "Trust is far more expensive." No one disagreed. Richard returned to his office overlooking the harbor and closed the door behind him. For the first time in many years, the room felt unusually quiet. His desk held awards for innovation, framed magazine covers, and photographs from charity events where cameras had captured carefully practiced smiles. None of those achievements seemed to matter while the tablet resting before him replayed the same 60 seconds again and again. This time he noticed details he had completely missed inside the restaurant. Naomi had apologized for the interruption. She had offered to replace the drink. She had continued treating every guest with courtesy even after being embarrassed. She had not insulted him once. He paused the video on the moment she quietly said, "Everyone deserves respect, sir." The sentence lingered in the silence long after the screen stopped moving. Richard leaned back slowly and stared through the office windows at the harbor below. Ships crossed the water without urgency while sunlight reflected across the waves in soft silver lines. Success had taught him how to win negotiations, build companies, and influence markets. It had never taught him how to recognize dignity standing directly in front of him. For the first time in a career built on certainty, Richard Caldwell found himself asking a question that no business strategy could answer. What if the most powerful person in that restaurant had never been the man sitting at the head of the table, but the woman who quietly refused to surrender her self-respect even when it cost her everything she thought she could not afford to lose? 3 days later, Naomi Brooks walked into a small neighborhood cafe on the east side of Baltimore, wearing a simple blue sweater and carrying the same canvas tote she had used for years. The cafe owner had offered her temporary work until she decided what came next, and she accepted with quiet gratitude. The place was nothing like Harbor and Vine. There were no marble floors, no luxury watches resting beside fine china, and no executives discussing billion-dollar deals. Instead, fresh cinnamon rolls cooled behind the counter, children laughed over hot chocolate, and neighbors greeted one another by their first names. Naomi found comfort in the ordinary rhythm of the morning. She poured coffee, smiled at regular customers, and thanked every guest exactly as she always had. She never mentioned the video unless someone else brought it up, and even then, she gently changed the conversation. She wanted peace more than attention. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the small bell above the entrance chimed softly. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. Richard Caldwell stepped inside alone. There were no assistants following him, no security personnel, no photographers, and no carefully prepared public relations team. He wore a plain charcoal jacket instead of one of his custom-tailored business suits, and for the first time since Naomi had met him, he looked less like a celebrated executive and more like an ordinary man carrying an invisible weight. Several customers recognized him immediately, but returned to their conversations without reaching for their phones. Richard approached the counter slowly until only a few feet separated them. Naomi looked up with the same calm expression she offered every customer. "Good morning," she said. "What can I get for you today?" Richard looked at the handwritten menu for only a moment before quietly shaking his head. "I did not come for coffee," he answered. "I came because I owe you something that should have been given days ago." Naomi waited patiently without interrupting. Richard took a slow breath. "I spent my entire career believing that achievement gave me the right to judge people before I knew them. I embarrassed you in front of strangers, and I failed to show you the basic respect every human being deserves. I cannot change what happened, but I am deeply sorry." The cafe remained almost perfectly silent. Even the espresso machine had finished steaming milk, leaving only the faint sound of rain beginning to tap against the front windows. Naomi studied his face for several seconds. She saw no cameras searching for the perfect apology, no audience waiting to applaud. Only a man who finally understood the distance between success and wisdom. She smiled gently, not because the pain had disappeared, but because bitterness had never been the future she wanted for herself. "I accept your apology," she said softly. "Not because the moment did not hurt, but because holding on to anger would only allow it to keep hurting." Richard lowered his eyes. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" Naomi thought for a moment before answering. "Treat the next person whose job seems invisible with the same respect you expect for yourself. That will matter more than anything you could ever do for me." Richard nodded slowly. The simplicity of her answer struck him more deeply than any criticism could have. He reached into his pocket, removed a business card, and placed it gently on the counter. "If you ever choose to continue your journalism studies, my foundation will pay every remaining tuition bill with no conditions attached." Naomi looked at the card but did not pick it up immediately. "If I accept," she said quietly, "it will be because education opens doors, not because I need someone to rescue me." Richard offered the first, genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "That is exactly the answer I hoped you would give." 1 year later, the spring sun settled gently across the campus of the University of Maryland as families gathered beneath blooming trees, waiting for the graduation ceremony to begin. The air carried the scent of fresh grass and flowering dogwoods, while rows of white chairs stretched across the lawn beneath clear blue skies. Graduates adjusted their black gowns and laughed with classmates, their excitement mixing with quiet relief after years of determination. Among them stood Naomi Brooks, holding her graduation cap carefully in one hand before placing it over neatly braided hair. Around her neck rested a simple silver pendant that had belonged to her mother for many years. Gloria Brooks sat proudly in the front section, healthier now after months of successful treatment, smiling through grateful tears as she watched the daughter who had once set aside her own dreams finally reclaim them. The scholarship that helped Naomi return to school had never become a public announcement. It had quietly covered tuition, books, and transportation exactly as promised, without interviews, advertisements, or conditions. Naomi insisted on continuing to work part-time at the neighborhood cafe throughout college because she wanted every achievement to remain connected to the same humility that had guided her long before the world learned her name. She graduated with honors in journalism, earning recognition not only for academic excellence, but also for a series of investigative stories highlighting overlooked workers whose everyday kindness often went unnoticed. Her professors admired her talent, but even more, they admired the compassion that shaped every story she chose to tell. As the ceremony began, applause rolled gently across the lawn while graduates crossed the stage one by one. When Naomi's name echoed through the speakers, the applause grew unexpectedly louder. Some people recognized her from the video that had once filled millions of screens. Others knew nothing about that afternoon and simply celebrated another student reaching an important milestone. Naomi accepted her diploma with the same quiet smile she had carried through every chapter of her journey. She did not wave dramatically or seek attention. She simply paused for a brief moment, looked toward her mother, and nodded with grateful eyes. Several rows behind the families, seated quietly among hundreds of guests, Richard Caldwell stood as the audience applauded. He had chosen a seat near the back, telling no one he planned to attend. There were no reporters waiting outside, no corporate announcements, and no expectation that anyone would notice him. He applauded not because he wished to repair his reputation, but because he sincerely respected the woman standing on that stage. Over the past year, he had changed policies throughout his company, introducing leadership training centered on dignity, respect, and accountability at every level of the organization. Employees noticed the difference long before the public did. Meetings became conversations instead of commands. Executives were encouraged to spend time alongside frontline workers. Recognition programs celebrated kindness as intentionally as performance. Richard never claimed those changes erased the mistakes of his past. They simply reflected the person he was still learning to become. As the ceremony ended, graduates tossed their caps into the bright afternoon sky, and hundreds of black squares rose together before slowly drifting back toward waiting hands. Naomi stepped away from the crowd and paused beneath a large oak tree where warm sunlight filtered softly through the leaves. A gentle breeze carried the distant laughter of families beginning new memories. She closed her eyes for one peaceful breath before continuing forward beside her mother, neither of them looking back. Behind them, Richard quietly turned and walked toward the parking lot without asking for thanks or recognition. Some victories arrived through applause, others through silence. On that warm spring afternoon, the loudest truth needed no words at all. Real strength had never belonged to the person with the highest title. It had always belonged to the person who refused to surrender kindness when the world gave every reason to do otherwise.